This is the story of a single night, the night the fire that would reshape Rome first found its breath, and before the flames there was only an ordinary summer evening settling gently over the city. Picture the air near the Circus Maximus in the last hour before full dark. The great stadium sits quiet between crowds, its long oval shadow stretching toward the Palatine, and the streets around it are filled with the small, unremarkable business of people finishing their day. If this drift into an ordinary Roman evening feels like your kind of place, leave a comment with the everyday sound you'd most want to hear drifting from an old street at dusk, and consider liking or subscribing for more restful history. The shops lining the base of the hills are shuttering, one by one, their wooden counters folded up and tied with rope, their goods pulled back into narrow storerooms behind curtains of cloth or hide. These are modest businesses, tightly packed against one another, selling rope, cloth, oil, baskets, and the countless small goods that keep a city functioning. A shopkeeper might be counting coins by the last grey light, murmuring to a neighbor about the day's trade, while a boy sweeps straw and scraps into the gutter that runs down the center of the street. Tacitus, writing decades after these events, tells us this district near the circus was known for shops filled with what he calls inflammable wares, meaning oils, textiles, and other flammable stock crowded into wooden structures. He does not describe this particular evening for us. No ancient author walked these streets that night with a lamp and a notebook. What we can say with confidence is that this was a commercial quarter built dense and combustible, and that its ordinary evening rhythms were, in hindsight, the quiet architecture of vulnerability. Historians today lean on this same account, along with the physical logic of the terrain, to picture the kind of neighborhood this must have been: cramped, busy, and thoroughly ordinary. Beyond the shopfronts, taverns are just beginning their livelier hours. A tavern near the circus in this period would have been a small, low room, perhaps with a stone counter set into the wall, jars of wine and cheap food kept within reach, and a few wooden stools crowded around low tables. Laborers who spent the day hauling stone, driving carts, or working the docks along the Tiber might stop here before heading home, trading complaints about wages or gossip about the games. Their voices would carry into the street, mixing with the calls of latecomers still hurrying past, and with the occasional bray of a mule resisting its harness. Mule and cart traffic was a constant feature of Roman city life, and evening was one of its busiest windows, since heavy wagons were often restricted from daytime streets and only allowed to move once the sun began to lower. This detail is a matter of general Roman urban practice rather than something recorded specifically for this night, but it fits naturally into the scene. Cartwheels grinding over uneven paving stones, wooden axles creaking under the weight of amphorae or bundled cloth, drivers shouting for room in streets barely wide enough for two mules to pass. The narrowness of these streets is not incidental detail. Tacitus explicitly describes old Rome's streets as narrow, winding, and irregular, a feature of the city's organic growth that would later matter enormously once fire found its way into these same passages. Above the street level, families are settling into their evening routines inside the insulae, the multi-story apartment blocks that housed most of Rome's population. These buildings were often constructed with wooden upper floors and timber balconies, materials chosen for speed and affordability rather than resistance to flame. In the fading light, someone leans out from a third-floor window to check on drying laundry. Someone else calls down to a child playing near the doorway, and somewhere a woman argues gently with a vendor over the last price of the evening for bread or oil. These are small, human gestures, the kind that happened every night in Rome and left no trace in any surviving text, but which any reasonable reconstruction of urban life in this period would expect to find here. The mixed social life of the Circus Maximus district gave this neighborhood a particular character. It sat at the crossing point between the grand entertainment world of chariot races and public spectacle and the working, mercantile world of ordinary trade. Wealthier residents might pass through on their way from the Palatine, glancing at shop fronts without stopping, while porters and shop assistants moved in the opposite direction, heading toward cheaper lodging further from the hills. This was not a district of one class or one rhythm, but a place where different layers of Roman society brushed against each other in the course of an ordinary evening. As true dusk settles, oil lamps begin to appear in doorways and window openings, their small flames multiplying along the street like a second, dimmer constellation replacing the fading sky. Each lamp represents a tiny, deliberate act, a wick trimmed, oil checked, a flame coaxed into being to push back the coming dark. Multiply that single gesture by the thousands of households and shop fronts packed into this part of the city, and the ordinary evening becomes, quite literally, a landscape lit by countless small fires held just barely in check by wood, clay, and human care. None of this would have felt remarkable to the people living through it. Lighting a lamp at dusk was as unremarkable as breathing, a small ritual repeated every evening of every year. The Vigiles, Rome's night watch and firefighting force, had not yet begun their patrols in earnest, though their presence would soon become part of this same landscape, moving through these streets with buckets and blankets, alert for exactly this kind of casual flame grown careless. For now, though, in this early hour, the greater danger sleeping inside the ordinary lamplit evening remains entirely invisible. Food sellers linger a little longer than the shopkeepers, since evening is prime business for a hot meal bought on the street rather than cooked at home. Many residents of the insulae had no proper kitchen at all, relying instead on these vendors or on small charcoal braziers balanced precariously on balconies and windowsills. The smell of grilling meat or frying dough would have drifted through the narrow streets, mixing with smoke, dust, and the general must of a crowded ancient city in high summer. It is a comforting image, and a genuinely well-supported one in terms of how Romans without kitchens fed themselves, even though no source describes this specific night's specific meal. By the time full darkness settles over the Circus Maximus and its surrounding streets, the district has completed its daily transformation from commerce to leisure, from open shop fronts to shuttered storerooms, from daylight bustle to lamp-lit murmur. Children have mostly been called inside. The heavier cart traffic has thinned as loads reach their destinations. Tavern voices grow a little louder as the night deepens, floating out over rooftops that, in a matter of hours, will carry something far less pleasant. Nothing in this evening announces catastrophe. The summer heat that has lingered through the day is unremarkable for the season. The timber-heavy construction, the oil lamps, the packed lodging houses, and the flammable goods sitting in the shops beside the Circus Maximus are simply the ordinary materials of Roman urban life, the same combination of convenience and risk that had existed for generations without incident. If there is a lesson to take from this last ordinary evening, it is only this: disaster rarely announces itself through anything the people living through the moment before it could reasonably be expected to notice. And yet, within those same shops, lamps, and cooking fires lay the raw material for what was about to happen, an entire city built, quite unintentionally, to burn. An entire city built, quite unintentionally, to burn. That is where the previous evening left us, standing among the shop fronts near the Circus Maximus in the last hour before full dark, and it is worth returning to that thought before the story moves forward. The danger waiting in Rome was not a single flaw hidden somewhere in the city's design. It was woven into thousands of ordinary habits, repeated in thousands of ordinary households, night after night for generations, without anyone thinking twice about them. Begin with light, because light was the first problem Rome had to solve every single evening. Once the sun dropped behind the rooftops, the city did not simply go dark. It went orange and gold in scattered points, because darkness was inconvenient, and Romans had long since solved that inconvenience with fire. Oil lamps sat on shelves, hung from hooks near doorways, and rested in the hands of servants guiding their masters home through unlit streets. Each lamp held a small, contained flame, fed by oil, usually reliable and usually harmless on its own. But a city of hundreds of thousands of residents did not need every lamp to behave carelessly. It needed only a handful, out of the countless numbers burning at any given hour, to be knocked loose, forgotten too near a stack of cloth, or left exposed to a draught slipping through a window shutter. Multiply that single lamp by every apartment, every shop counter, every tavern table in the district, and the sheer number of small flames burning across Rome on an average night becomes difficult to picture all at once. Researchers studying fire risk in Roman domestic life have noted how ordinary this kind of open flame was, less an exception to daily routine than a constant, low companion to it. Then there was cooking, which added its own layer of risk to every residential block. Wealthier households might have a proper kitchen built around a raised masonry hearth, safely separated from the rest of the living space. Many residents living in the crowded upper floors of Rome's tall apartment buildings had no such luxury. Meals were often prepared on portable braziers, small movable stoves filled with glowing charcoal, set wherever there happened to be room, sometimes near a window for ventilation, sometimes uncomfortably close to a wooden partition or a stack of stored belongings. These braziers were practical, cheap, and easy to move from room to room as needed. They were also, by their very nature, fire kept only just contained, holding coals that could smolder long after a meal was finished, especially if a tired tenant set the brazier aside for the night without a final check. No single evening of careless cooking is recorded as the cause of anything in particular here. This is simply what the ordinary rhythm of feeding a household looked like across the crowded floors of the city, repeated in countless rooms at once. Now, consider what all of that fire was surrounded by, because the materials of the city mattered just as much as the flames themselves. Rome was, in large part, a timber city wearing a stone face. Its grand public buildings, temples, and monuments were built from stone and concrete, solid and slow to burn. But the residential blocks where most ordinary people actually lived, the tall, narrow apartment buildings known as insulae, relied heavily on wood for upper floors, interior beams, staircases, and the thin partitions dividing one family's rented rooms from the next. Wood was cheaper than stone, lighter to work with, and far faster to repair, all of which mattered enormously in a city constantly growing, constantly patched, constantly rebuilt to squeeze in more residents than its footprint comfortably allowed. Historians who study Rome has what some now call a fire regime, meaning a city whose entire pattern of construction and daily behavior made fire a recurring feature of urban life rather than a rare disaster, point repeatedly to this dependence on timber as one of the central reasons flames could travel so quickly once they started. Stone can resist a fire for a long while. Timber, packed tightly and dried by summer heat, tends to invite it forward. Add to this the lodging houses themselves, standing shoulder to shoulder along narrow streets, sharing walls, sharing roof lines, and sometimes sharing alleys barely wide enough for a single loaded cart to pass through without scraping both sides. Upper floors often leaned slightly outward over the street below, a design that gained precious extra living space, but also meant buildings on opposite sides of a lane could sit remarkably close to one another near the rooftops. A flame that reached a window shutter or a wooden balcony rail did not necessarily need to leap across any real gap. Under the wrong conditions, it might simply lean into its neighbor. Move a little further out, from the residential blocks toward the busy commercial ground near the Circus Maximus, and the picture becomes even more combustible. The shops crowded along that district were not simply selling finished goods to passers-by. Many doubled as small workshops, places where raw materials were stored, cut, dried, or otherwise processed, often using their own modest heat sources close at hand. A textile seller might keep bundles of dyed cloth stacked dry against a back wall. A woodworker's stall might have shavings and offcuts swept into a corner rather than cleared away at the end of the day. Oil merchants stored their stock in large ceramic containers, but oil itself, once spilled or loosed from its vessel, burns and spreads across surfaces in a way water never could. Grain dealers kept dry stock that could smolder unnoticed for a surprising stretch of time before catching in earnest. None of these were reckless practices taken alone. They were simply the ordinary machinery of city commerce, repeated shop after shop, doorway after doorway, all along the busy frontage bordering the great stadium described in the previous evening's account. It is worth being careful here because the evidence supports a general pattern rather than any single culprit. Fire risk research into this period does not claim that any one particular shop, stove, or careless worker was responsible for what came next. What it does show with reasonable confidence is that retail and storage spaces of exactly this kind commonly combined open heat sources with dense, combustible stock kept close by, which left them structurally far more vulnerable than a stone temple or a marble portico could ever be. This was not a flaw unique to Rome. Similar conditions existed in many crowded cities of the ancient world, but scale changes the stakes considerably, and Rome's scale, its density, its sheer concentration of shops, lodgings, and workshops packed into limited space meant that the consequences of any single mistake had room to grow far larger than they might have elsewhere. None of this suggests the city was foolish or blind to its own risk. If anything, the opposite is closer to true. Romans had lived alongside fire for so long that most of their habits reflected a kind of practiced, inherited caution, shaped by decades of small local fires that had never grown into anything citywide. Basins of water were often kept near hearths. Storage areas were separated from living space wherever room allowed it. Certain trades involving higher heat were gradually pushed toward the city's edges precisely because of the danger they carried. None of these measures removed the risk entirely. They simply managed it, the way any densely built, wood-framed, lamp-lit city might manage a danger it could never fully eliminate. That management, though, depended entirely on constant human attention, because a lamp left unwatched, a brazier left glowing, or a storeroom left unchecked overnight could undo hours of careful precaution in only a few unlucky minutes. Rome understood this risk well enough to build an entire institution specifically to guard against it, sending trained men out into the darkened streets each night to watch for exactly the kinds of trouble this chapter has been describing. It is to their rounds through the lanes near the Circus Maximus, walking past the same shuttered shops and glowing braziers just described, that the story now turns. It is to their rounds through the lanes near the Circus Maximus, walking past the same shuttered shops and glowing braziers just described, that the story now turns. Rome did not leave its safety entirely to chance. Somewhere in the growing dusk, men were already stepping out from barracks scattered through the city, beginning the work that fell to them every night whether or not anything unusual happened. These were the Vigiles, and understanding what they were and what they were not matters a great deal to how this particular night eventually unfolded. The Vigiles were Rome's organized night watch, a body created to patrol the streets after dark and to respond when fire broke out. They were not volunteers gathering informally at the first sign of smoke, and they were not soldiers summoned from some distant garrison outside the walls. They belonged to cohorts, housed in barracks positioned around the city, which meant Rome treated fire danger as a standing municipal problem rather than an occasional emergency to be improvised each time. A man serving in the Vigiles, reported for duty, knew his commanders, and walked routes that were, in principle, established and repeatable from one night to the next. This was, by the standards of the ancient world, a serious piece of civic infrastructure, built specifically because a city of Rome's size and density could not simply hope for good fortune. Picture one of these patrols setting out as the sky over the Circus Maximus deepened from gold toward a heavier blue. A handful of men, dressed for walking rather than for battle, moved together along a street still busy with late shoppers and the last customers lingering outside taverns. They carry equipment that marks them as different from ordinary pedestrians, buckets meant for water, and hooks or poles designed for pulling apart burning material before that material could spread its flames any further. This particular scene is reconstruction in its details, since no surviving account describes exactly what one patrol carried on one specific evening, but the tools themselves are well established as standard parts of the Vigiles kit, used across the city as an ordinary matter of routine. Their evening did not begin with fire. It began with the plain texture of policing a crowded neighborhood. The Vigiles served as a kind of night watch in the broader sense, alert to thieves working the shadows between shop fronts, disturbances spilling out from noisy taverns, and the occasional runaway slave trying to slip unnoticed through a back alley. A patrol moving past the Circus Maximus that evening would have been just as likely to break up an argument over an unpaid debt as to notice smoke curling from a cookshop chimney. This dual duty is worth pausing on because it shapes how we ought to imagine their attention. They were not fire specialists standing motionless, watching only for flame. They were general keepers of order who happened to be trained and equipped for fire specifically because fire was the disaster most likely to overwhelm everything else they were meant to manage. Their presence gave Rome real advantages, and it would be a mistake to understate them. A trained group with buckets and hooks, moving through streets they knew well, could respond faster than untrained residents scrambling in confusion once flames appeared. They understood, at least in general terms, which buildings held stored goods, which alleys narrowed dangerously, and which structures might need to be pulled down early rather than fought room by room as fire advanced. Demolition, in fact, was one of their most important tools. Ancient accounts describing later stages of this very fire mention buildings being torn down deliberately to slow the flames, and this approach fits naturally with what we know of the Vigiles methods in general. Extinguishing a fire directly was often less realistic than removing its fuel before flames could reach it, and a hook capable of collapsing a wooden awning or loosening roof tiles served that purpose more reliably than water carried bucket by bucket. Something but advantages are not guarantees, and this is the heart of what a summer night in Rome could never promise its residents. The city was too large and too densely built for any night watch, however well organized, to be everywhere at once. A cohort assigned to a given district covered a specific stretch of streets, and however diligent its rounds, there were always more lanes than eyes to watch them, more shuttered shops than hands to check their braziers. If a fire began at a moment when the nearest patrol was several streets away, occupied with a drunk customer or a theft already underway, precious minutes could pass before anyone trained to respond even learned that trouble had started. In a city built largely from timber-heavy tenements and packed tightly with flammable stock, minutes were rarely a small margin. They were often the entire difference between a contained flare and a fire that had already reached its second building. Distance was only part of the difficulty. Access mattered just as much, and access in Rome was rarely simple. The same narrow, twisting streets that made the neighborhood near the Circus Maximus lively and commercially rich also made it hard to move through quickly once urgency arrived. A patrol summoned from its usual route might have to push through evening crowds, duck around covered stalls still being folded away for the night, or find its most direct path blocked by handcarts and curious onlookers. None of this required any special misfortune. It was simply how a crowded Roman street behaved on an ordinary evening, and it meant that even a fast decision to respond could be slowed by the very geography the Vigiles were meant to protect. There is also the matter of scale in a more basic sense. The Vigiles were a city-wide institution, but Rome itself was an enormous and unevenly built metropolis, and no surviving source tells us precisely how many men were on duty in this particular district on this particular summer night. It is reasonable to imagine a modest patrol, perhaps several men, walking a defined stretch of streets near the Circus Maximus, since that fits what is known of how cohorts were organized and spread across the city. But naming specific numbers beyond that would mean inventing a precision the evidence simply does not support. What can be said with real confidence is more modest. However many men were nearby, they could not have been in every alley, watching every brazier at every single moment of the evening. Gallows. So the patrol continues on, doing exactly what it was built to do. Footsteps on packed dirt, a word exchanged with a shopkeeper here, a glance toward a smoking chimney there, a brief pause outside a tavern where the noise seems a shade too rowdy for comfort. Nothing about this evening marks itself as different from countless evenings that came before it. The buckets swing lightly, mostly unused so far. The hooks rest across shoulders, tools without any target yet. It is, by every visible sign, an unremarkable patrol through an unremarkable summer night in a city that has weathered thousands of nights that looked very much like this one. And that, in the end, is the real lesson this rehearsed institution reveals. Rome had built something genuinely serious, trained men, standing barracks, purpose-made tools, and routines meant to catch danger before it could grow beyond control. The city was not defenseless, and it would be wrong to imagine otherwise, but readiness on paper and readiness in one particular burning moment are not the same thing, and the gap between them was measured in distance, in access, and in the small stretches of time that a fire, once loose, does not wait patiently to fill. Somewhere in the tangle of shop fronts and storerooms, this patrol had already passed, or was about to pass. That gap was beginning to matter more than anyone walking those streets could yet know. It is worth pausing here, before the story moves any further, to ask what we can actually claim to know about the moment the fire began. The honest answer is less than most retellings admit. No surviving record gives us a precise minute, a named shopkeeper, or a single identifiable spark. What we have instead is a general location, a plausible setting, and a historian writing years later who himself acknowledged that the cause was disputed even in his own time. That historian is Tacitus, and his account remains the strongest ancient evidence available to us. He tells us the fire broke out in the part of the Circus Maximus that touched the Palatine and Caelian hills, in a district crowded with shops selling exactly the kind of merchandise most likely to catch and hold flame. He does not tell us which shop, or whether it was oil, cloth, timber shavings, or something else entirely that first caught. He does not name a single person present at the outbreak, and crucially, he tells us that even among Romans living through the disaster, opinions differed on whether the fire was an accident of chance or something set deliberately, possibly at the emperor's own instruction. That uncertainty is not a modern addition to the story. It was there from the beginning, woven into the earliest surviving account itself, and later retellings, however vivid, have never managed to resolve it. So when we imagine the first flames, we are reconstructing a likely texture of events, not reciting a documented sequence. Picture then one of those narrow shop fronts along the curve of the circus, its awning drawn for the night, its interior stacked with the kind of combustible goods that filled so many similar stalls throughout that district: dry textiles, coiled rope, jars of oil, bundled kindling meant for sale rather than for burning. A lamp left too close to a shelf, an ember carried by a stray gust from a nearby brazier, a pile of packing straw catching from a neighboring stall's cooking fire. Any of these would fit what we know of the setting, and any of them might be wrong. This is not a claim about what happened. It is a demonstration of how easily, in a district built exactly this way, something small could have become something else entirely. What likely happened first was smoke, not a wall of it, not the thick black plume that would later climb over the rooftops of half the city, but a thin, acrid thread rising from between two buildings, easy to miss if a person wasn't already looking upward, easy to mistake for a cooking fire slightly larger than usual. In a district full of braziers and lamps and constant low-grade haze, smoke on its own was not yet alarming. It was the kind of thing a passerby might glance at and keep walking, assuming someone inside was tending to it as they had 100 nights before. Then would have come light. Somewhere behind a shuttered window or through the gap beneath a doorway, a flicker brighter and steadier than lamplight, the particular orange glow that doesn't behave the way a controlled flame behaves. Whoever saw it first would have needed only a second or two to understand the difference between a fire someone is using and a fire that has slipped its bounds. That noticing, wherever and however it happened, is the true first moment of the disaster, even if no name survives to attach to it. History remembers the Great Fire of Rome. It does not remember the person who looked up and realized, quietly and then not quietly at all, that something had gone wrong. The alarm that followed would have spread the way alarms do in any dense, wakeful neighborhood at night, not through any formal system, but through voices. A shout from inside the burning stall, picked up by someone in the street, passed to a neighbor leaning out a window, carried down the block by whoever happened to be walking past a tavern doorway. Within a few minutes, a small crowd would likely have gathered, drawn by nothing more dramatic than the ordinary human instinct to see what the commotion is about. Some among them would have started shouting for water. Others, according to Tacitus, made things immediately harder rather than easier, calling out that they had authority to act while doing nothing useful, or in some cases throwing firebrands themselves, whether out of panic, mischief, or some motive lost entirely to us now. This detail, unsettling as it is, comes directly from the ancient account, and it complicates any tidy image of citizens calmly working together from the very first moment. Confusion, not coordination, seems to have characterized those opening minutes, and it is a detail worth sitting with rather than smoothing over. If Vigiles were nearby, as the previous chapter suggested they likely were somewhere in that district, this is the point where their training would have been tested against reality. A patrol arriving early enough might have thrown sand or water on a fire still contained to one stall, might have pulled burning materials into the street to smother them, might have shouted for buckets to be passed hand to hand from a nearby fountain or cistern. Rome's fire response depended enormously on exactly this kind of early intervention, catching a blaze while it was still small enough to smother. But we have no record telling us whether such an attempt was made here, how close it came to working, or how quickly it was overwhelmed. What we do know from Tacitus is that the flames gathered strength almost immediately, and that wind pushed them the length of the circus itself. Whatever containment efforts existed in those first minutes, they plainly did not hold. That single detail, the flames gathering strength immediately and being driven by wind, tells us something important about why the fire's beginning mattered so much for everything that followed. This was not a slow smolder that gave the city time to organize a response. It was a rapid transition from small and local to fast and directional, aided by exactly the conditions the shopfronts and warehouses of that district were least equipped to resist. Once the wind caught it, the fire was no longer behaving like an isolated accident. It was behaving like something moving with purpose down a corridor of fuel that Roman urban life had built for it, patiently and unknowingly, over generations of ordinary commerce. We should resist the temptation, appealing as it is, to imagine this moment with more clarity than the evidence allows. There was no single dramatic image, no crowd of onlookers already sensing the scale of what was coming. There was, most likely, a small commotion in one corner of a crowded, ordinary night, quickly followed by a slightly larger commotion, and then a commotion large enough that people farther away began to notice and to worry in earnest. The disaster that would eventually be remembered as one of the defining catastrophes of the ancient world almost certainly began as something far smaller and far more forgettable than legend has made it, at least for the first several minutes of its existence. Even later Roman writers, retelling the story with the benefit of hindsight, could not agree on more than this general shape: a shop district, a spark of uncertain origin, and a fire that did not stay small for long. What changed everything was not the size of the first flame, it was the character of the streets it was about to enter, streets never built to slow anything down, and it is to those streets, narrow and crowded and utterly unprepared, that the story now must turn. Streets never built to slow anything down. That is where the story left off, and it is exactly there that the fire, still young enough in its first minutes to look like a local misfortune, met the one feature of Rome that would decide almost everything else that happened that night. The neighborhood around the Circus Maximus had not been laid out with fire in mind. It had grown the way old cities grow, lane by lane, generation by generation, shaped by convenience rather than planning, and that unplanned geometry was about to matter enormously. Tacitus, writing decades later but drawing on memory and record closer to the event, describes this part of Rome as lacking the kind of solid masonry barriers or open ground that might have slowed a fire's advance. There were no wide stone breaks between buildings, no consistent gaps to stop flame from leaping shopfront to shopfront. Structures leaned against one another, sharing walls and sometimes roof beams, and stored their goods close to the street where customers could see them easily. This was efficient commerce. It was also, once flame took hold, a continuous line of fuel running in nearly every direction a person could walk. Add to this the wind. Tacitus is specific on this point, saying the fire grew fierce and rapid because of it, catching the length of the Circus Maximus almost as one continuous sheet of flame, rather than a scattered set of separate fires. We cannot know the wind's exact strength or direction with any precision. No instrument recorded it, and no eyewitness left behind the kind of measurement a modern reader might want. But the ancient testimony is consistent enough to trust in its general shape. Moving air took flame that might have stayed confined to a few stalls and carried it sideways, forward, upward into awnings and stacked wares, faster than anyone nearby could react. Picture, for a moment reconstructed rather than documented, a stall-keeper near the circus who had banked his cooking fire for the night, confident in a routine repeated hundreds of times before. He might have smelled smoke before he saw flame, glanced toward a neighboring shopfront and felt the small lurch of alarm that comes when something ordinary turns out not to be ordinary at all. Multiply that moment across a dozen shopkeepers on a dozen adjoining stalls, each with only seconds to decide whether to fight the fire, save their goods, or run, and the shape of the disaster becomes visible not as one event but as many small individual failures of time happening at once. This is the point where the Vigiles, introduced earlier in their patrols through these same lanes, would have found themselves outpaced almost immediately. A trained watchman arriving at a burning shopfront with a bucket, a hook, or a wet cloth could do real work against a fire that was still one fire, still confined to a single building or a short row of stalls. But a fire moving with wind behind it does not wait for that watchman to arrive, and it does not stay in one place long enough for a bucket line to form. By the time word reached a second post, a third shopfront might already be catching, and the very organization that made the Vigiles effective under ordinary conditions, their division into local patrol districts, became a liability once the emergency stopped being local. The streets themselves worked against every effort at coordination. Tacitus describes old Rome's layout as narrow, winding passages and irregular streets, and this is not simply a poetic flourish. It reflects a real, physically constraining problem. A watchman trying to move reinforcements from one district to another had to navigate lanes that bent unpredictably, doubled back, and narrowed further as onlookers, cart traffic, and fleeing residents began filling them. What might have been a 2 or 3 minute walk under ordinary evening conditions could stretch much longer once panic entered the streets, and every minute lost that way was a minute the fire used to advance further than any single relief effort could compensate for. It is worth pausing on how ordinary commerce complicated this further. The evening traffic described earlier, carts still being unloaded, laborers moving goods toward warehouses, late customers lingering near open stalls, meant that many lanes were already partially obstructed before anyone knew a fire had begun. A watchman moving toward the source of smoke might have to push past a loaded cart or press against a wall while other residents pushed the opposite direction, carrying whatever they had managed to grab. None of this is dramatic in the way later retellings would make it. It is simply the plain mechanical reality of narrow space filling with more people and more urgency than it was ever built to hold. Tacitus goes further, describing how the human response itself became part of the obstruction. Frightened residents, especially those trying to protect elderly relatives, young children, or the infirm, often paused in the street rather than moving straight through it, some waiting for family members still inside buildings, others slowed by carrying more than they could easily manage. This is reported as an eyewitness impression rather than something that can be measured today, but it fits naturally with what dense, panicked movement through tight urban space would produce. A street built for measured daily foot traffic does not absorb a sudden crowd of frightened people well, and the resulting congestion cost time that the fire did not require anyone to spend. There is one further complication worth naming carefully because it comes from Tacitus but remains firmly in the territory of allegation rather than established fact. He reports that some men were seen openly obstructing efforts to fight the flames and in certain cases even feeding them, claiming they acted under orders when challenged. This detail has fueled centuries of speculation about deliberate arson, and later chapters will need to address those suspicions directly. For now, in the immediate chaos of this early spreading phase, the more defensible point is simply that organized firefighting, whatever form it took, was being actively undermined by confusion and rumor, and possibly by isolated bad actors, on top of every physical obstacle already described. Whether any of this reflects coordinated sabotage or scattered opportunism amid disorder is not something the surviving evidence lets us settle with confidence. What emerges from all of this is not a single dramatic turning point, but an accumulation, one factor compounding another until the whole district was working against itself. Wind gave the flames speed. The absence of masonry fire breaks gave it a continuous path. Narrow, winding streets slowed every attempt to respond and denied watchmen any real chance of moving faster than the fire itself. Crowds, however understandably frightened, added their own friction to streets already too tight for the moment, and scattered instances of interference, real or rumored, layered suspicion onto a night that badly needed clear coordination and received very little of it. By the time this convergence of factors had fully asserted itself, the fire near the Circus Maximus was no longer a localized incident that a handful of trained men with buckets and hooks could reasonably expect to contain. It had become something closer to a moving weather event, following the logic of wind and fuel, rather than the logic of any single district's emergency plan. Somewhere beyond the shop fronts where it started, in houses and lodging blocks that had gone to rest with no reason to expect any of this, families were about to feel that shift arrive at their own doorways, whether through smoke drifting under a shutter or a neighbor's voice calling up from the street below. A neighbor's voice calling up from the street below. That is where the story left off, and for many households in the districts nearest the Circus Maximus, that voice, or a curl of smoke finding its way beneath a shutter, was the entire warning they received. There was no formal alarm system to depend on, no bell rung in careful sequence across the city, no single signal that meant the same thing to everyone who heard it. What woke people in the Reconstruction historians consider most plausible was noise and smell arriving almost together, followed within moments by the sight of an orange glow in a part of the sky where no lamp of that size belonged. It is worth pausing on how little time this actually gave anyone. A household roused at a reasonable hour has the luxury of thinking things through, of weighing one choice against another. A household roused by fire already moving through nearby streets does not have that luxury. Tacitus, writing decades after the event, describes a night defined by disorder, with people running in different directions, uncertain where safety truly lay or which street might still be open. That detail matters here before we even ask what individuals tried to save, because it tells us that many of them never reached the composed, orderly moment we might imagine when picturing someone calmly gathering belongings. They had confusion first, and whatever decisions followed were squeezed into the handful of seconds left inside that confusion. Even so, it is reasonable to reconstruct the general kinds of things a person might instinctively reach for based on what we know of ordinary Roman households and the broader pattern visible in the ancient accounts. Coins are the most defensible example. Archaeological work in the Forum area has uncovered a concentration of coinage that researchers have interpreted as small personal money, the sort a person might carry while fleeing rather than leave behind in a locked strongbox at home. It is a modest clue, but a telling one. It points not toward treasure or family heirlooms, but toward pocket change, grabbed because it happened to be close at hand, light enough to carry, and immediately useful wherever the night might end. Beyond that single, physically attested detail, the sources do not hand us a tidy list of saved objects, and it would be misleading to pretend otherwise. What we can offer instead is careful, bounded probability rather than certainty. A household lamp might have been knocked over or abandoned lit rather than deliberately put out, adding its own small danger to an already dangerous night. A cloak or blanket kept near a sleeping area could double as protection against drifting sparks on the way outside, thrown over shoulders more out of habit than calculation. A pouch of coins, a piece of jewelry already worn rather than stored away, a single tool essential to a trade. These are the kinds of items that make sense for people moving quickly through darkened, smoke-filled rooms, and they fit the wider pattern of hurried, selective salvage rather than any considered process of packing. For those living above workshops, especially along the shop-lined streets near the Circus Maximus that this story has followed since the very first evening, the line between household and livelihood was thin, sometimes barely a floor apart. A cobbler's awl, a weaver's shuttle, a merchant's set of scales. These were not simply possessions sitting on a shelf. They were the means of earning a living the following week, assuming there would be a shop left standing in which to use them. Archaeological reporting on the Palatine shops suggests that many of the people working there were caught by surprise, without enough warning to secure their premises or gather even their essential tools before the fire reached that stretch of street. If that was true for people working close to the source of the fire, and presumably among the first to sense danger, it becomes easier to imagine how much harder the situation grew for households 1 or 2 streets further away, roused later, moving already through air thick with smoke and the sound of shouting. Older residents and young children complicated nearly every decision that followed. A person capable of moving quickly through a dark, crowded, unfamiliar-feeling street at night was in one kind of danger. A person who needed to be carried, guided, or coaxed down a narrow stairway step by uncertain step multiplied that danger considerably, for themselves and for whoever stayed close beside them. It is not difficult to picture in a general and deliberately unspecific way hallway, adult children supporting elderly parents down steep interior stairs built for daylight use, or a young child gripped firmly by one hand while the other arm still tried to manage some small bundle of belongings pressed against a hip. None of this comes from a surviving account naming particular people in a particular house. It is the kind of scene that follows reasonably from what we already know about Roman household structure, building design, and the physical demands of evacuating a burning building in darkness. Tacitus adds a further layer here that keeps this chapter from settling into comfortable sentiment. He describes people who, having gone out to help neighbors whose homes had already caught fire, returned to discover that their own houses were burning as well, with no earlier warning at all. This detail matters because it undercuts any tidy image of households calmly assessing what could and could not be saved. For some families that night, there was no interval whatsoever between mild concern for someone else's misfortune and the sudden, total loss of their own home. The fire did not wait politely for awareness to catch up with it, and in a number of cases across the affected districts, it appears to have outrun that awareness completely. This is where the emotional shift at the center of the night becomes clearest. In its opening hour, for most people not standing directly beside it, the fire was still an inconvenience happening somewhere else, a distant glow to be watched from a window, or a piece of news carried along by a breathless returning neighbor. But as smoke thickened inside occupied rooms and the sound of collapsing timber and tile grew nearer, that same fire became something else entirely, an irreversible departure from a home that, in a great many cases, would not exist by the time morning arrived. The difference between salvaging a household with some measure of calm and abandoning it in outright fear was almost never a matter of personal courage or foresight. It was mostly a matter of how much warning time the fire happened to allow, and for a large share of Roman households that night, the honest answer is very little. Many households, it is tempting, looking back with all the comfort of distance and hindsight, to imagine careful scenes of selection, a family lifting a strongbox together, wrapping some treasured object in cloth, folding important documents neatly into a satchel before stepping calmly into the street. Some version of that almost certainly happened somewhere in the city, particularly among wealthier households with more warning, more household slaves to assist, and more physical distance from the initial flames. But the dominant pattern suggested by both the literary account and the physical evidence recovered from the affected districts leans closer to sudden flight than to any deliberate, unhurried packing. People took what was near, what was small, what could be carried in one arm while the other steadied a child or supported an unsteady relative, coins rather than chests, a single familiar tool rather than an entire workshop's inventory, a cloak thrown over the shoulders rather than a wardrobe carried out piece by piece. Tacitus offers one final, sobering observation that belongs here rather than later in this story. He notes that some people, having lost their possessions and with them their ordinary means of living, chose not to attempt saving themselves at all, overwhelmed by the completeness of what the fire had already taken from them. It is a difficult detail, and this narration will not linger on it, but it is included because it shows how total the loss could already feel in these first hours, well before the fire's full extent across the city became clear to anyone. For those particular people, the failure to salvage anything meaningful was not carelessness or hesitation. It was simply the plain arithmetic of speed against distance and of fire against ordinary human bodies trying to outrun it. By the point most households finally reached the street, whatever they happened to be holding had, in effect, become final. There would be no calm return trip to retrieve a forgotten item, no second attempt at a more careful, considered selection once the initial panic passed. The choice made in that first rushed moment, however incomplete and however hurried, was the only inventory that would survive the night for a great many Roman families, and as they moved out into streets already crowded with neighbors caught in that same narrow window between warning and loss, the fire behind them was only beginning beginning to reach the places where Rome stored not household goods carried in a single arm, but goods by the wagon load, the warehouses and market stalls whose burning would soon turn a neighborhood disaster into something the whole city would feel. Goods by the wagon load. That is where the story left off, and it is here, among the warehouses and market stalls surrounding the Circus Maximus, that the fire stopped behaving like a household misfortune and began behaving like something closer to an engine. Rome's commercial districts were not simply places where people bought and sold things. They were places where the city stored the raw materials of its own daily survival, packed into structures that had never been designed with anything like this night in mind. What had made the district convenient by day, its density, its closeness, its constant movement of goods, now worked entirely against it. To understand why this district burned the way it did, it helps to think plainly about what such shops and storerooms actually held. Textiles hung in bundles or lay folded on shelves, absorbent and quick to catch. Oil, used for lamps, for cooking, and for the body itself in bath culture, sat stored in jars and skins that could rupture and spread burning liquid rather than simply feed a flame in place. Grain, essential to feeding a city of this size, filled sacks stacked high in confined rooms, and grain dust alone, disturbed by heat and sudden movement, could behave in ways that startled even those who handled it every day of their working lives. Timber framing, shelving, and support beams ran through nearly every structure, whether shop, warehouse, or the stalls lining the market corridors between them. None of this is exotic. It is simply what a large, ancient city needed to keep functioning, and on this particular night, it became fuel for something none of it was built to survive. It is worth pausing on a caution here, one the ancient sources themselves invite us to take seriously. No surviving account gives us an inventory of exactly what sat in the shops nearest the fire's origin. We do not have a ledger, a named merchant describing his losses commodity by commodity, or a precise list of what burned first and what followed after. What we do have is a reasonably confident sense of what this kind of district generally held, based on how Roman commercial life organized itself near a major public venue like the Circus Maximus. So when this chapter speaks of oil, grain, timber, and cloth, it speaks of plausible and well-supported categories of goods, not a confirmed inventory of the specific shops where the fire began. The distinction matters for honesty's sake, even if the practical effect on the fire's behavior was much the same either way. What made this area especially dangerous was not any single commodity, but the way commerce had organized itself spatially, shop against shop, wall against shared wall. Storefronts sat nearly against one another, sharing walls, sharing roof lines, sharing the same narrow lanes used for deliveries during the day and foot traffic in the evening hours. Storerooms sat behind or above the shop fronts themselves, meaning that inventory was rarely far from an open flame used for light or small-scale food preparation. Porters and laborers moved constantly through these corridors, carrying goods in and out from dawn until well past dusk, and their daily routines had shaped the district into something dense, interconnected, and almost seamless in its fuel supply. A fire beginning in one shop did not need to leap far to reach the next. In many cases, given how closely these structures pressed together, it barely needed to leap at all. Picture, in a way consistent with what we know of such districts without claiming to document any specific scene, a porter pausing mid-task as the smell of smoke reaches him before any sound of alarm does. He may be standing between two storerooms, a sack of grain still balanced against his shoulder, uncertain whether what he smells drifts from somewhere distant or is already close enough to matter to him directly. This is the kind of ordinary, unremarkable moment that likely repeated itself many times that night, unnamed and unrecorded, as workers whose livelihoods depended on these goods faced the first uncertain signs that something larger than a contained mishap was now underway around them. For shopkeepers, the stakes were never simply about property in the abstract. A shop's inventory was often its owner's accumulated capital, built slowly across years, representing debts paid, family labor, and whatever modest security a household had managed to construct out of steady trade. To watch that inventory catch fire was to watch a livelihood dissolve in the same hour a home nearby might be lost as well. The ancient sources do not linger on individual shopkeepers by name, and this retelling will not invent any to fill that silence. But the shape of that loss, economic as much as physical, is consistent with what we understand of how such commercial districts functioned and how deeply ordinary households depended on them for their footing in the city. The chain reaction this chapter's title describes was not mysterious in its mechanics, even as its scale grew overwhelming. One burning shop could ignite adjoining walls or shared roof beams within minutes. Sparks and drifting embers, carried by the same wind already shaping the fire's path through nearby residential streets, could land on goods stacked exposed near stall fronts or open loading areas. Oil, once burning, could spread along the ground in a way dry timber alone could not, reaching stock that had not yet caught from heat or embers on its own. Each ignited storeroom did not simply burn where it stood, it became a new source feeding the next structure and the next corridor beyond it, in a sequence modern historians describe as accelerating rather than steady, each stage adding more heat and more fuel than the one before. It is in this stretch of the story that we also encounter a detail worth handling with particular care. A modern synthesis of the fire's history notes that the Vigiles, Rome's firefighting watch introduced earlier in this account, found themselves present in this commercial chaos not only as firefighters but, in some accounts, as men who took advantage of the disorder, demolishing property or removing goods while claiming to act under proper authority. This should not be mistaken for a fully documented pattern of behavior repeated everywhere that night. It reflects a broader uncertainty within the ancient tradition about how orderly or disorderly the response actually was once fire reached spaces filled with valuable, portable goods and confused chains of command. What can be said with more confidence is that authority itself became harder to read clearly once flames entered a district where property, survival, and improvised decision-making all collided at once, often within the same narrow street. For the laborers and porters who worked these market corridors daily, this collapse of clear authority likely mattered nearly as much as the fire itself. Men accustomed to moving goods on command now faced a night where no single voice could be trusted to represent the city's actual interest, or even a shop's own. Some may have worked to save what they could carry, dragging sacks or bundled cloth toward whatever exit still seemed clear. Others may have simply tried to reach safety, abandoning stock they had guarded for years without a backward glance. The ancient sources allow us to say only that confusion existed in this space, not to assign specific choices to specific individuals who remain unnamed and largely unknowable to us now, however much a fuller story might wish to name them. By the time this commercial chain reaction had run through a meaningful portion of the district, the fire's character had shifted again, and noticeably so. It was no longer only a residential emergency spreading through lodging blocks and narrow streets, nor only a commercial catastrophe consuming shops and warehouses in isolation. It had become both at once, a single expanding event drawing fuel from every kind of structure the city offered, indifferent to whether that structure held a family's bedding or a merchant's entire accumulated stock. This is the shape modern historians point to when they describe the fire's early spread as unusually fast and severe, precisely because of what stood so densely packed near its point of origin. And as flames moved through what had been Rome's commercial heart near the Circus Maximus, the people fleeing that burning district began to merge with those already flowing out of homes and lodging houses nearby, porters beside parents, shopkeepers beside neighbors they had only known by sight before. All of them were converging now on the same darkened streets, carrying whatever they had managed to save, and all of them were beginning to ask the same unspoken question: where in this city, if anywhere close by, still counted as open ground? Where in this city, if anywhere close by, still counted as open ground? That was the question forming on so many lips at once, and it did not have a single easy answer. Rome had never been designed with evacuation in mind. Its center was a maze of insulae and narrow lanes, its hills crowded with houses stacked close against one another, and its open spaces, where they existed at all, were scattered unevenly around the edges of the city rather than placed within easy reach of its densest quarters. For people now moving away from the Circus Maximus and its burning markets, finding somewhere safe meant guessing, often correctly and sometimes not, which direction led away from the fire rather than deeper into it. The account that survives from Tacitus offers a picture worth taking seriously, though it should be read as description rather than precise cartography. He tells us that as the fire advanced, panicked crowds fled toward nearby areas only to discover, in a cruel reversal, that those places too had already caught. This detail is best treated as testimony about the general character of that night's chaos, rather than a map of specific streets, since Tacitus was writing history shaped by hindsight and by the demands of dramatic narrative, not producing a surveyor's record of the city. Even so, the underlying claim fits what is known of how fires like this behave. They do not hold to a single predictable front, and a direction that seems safe at one moment can turn dangerous within a very short span of time. For crowds trying to navigate that shifting danger, the instinct to move toward wider, less enclosed ground made basic sense. Fire needs fuel, and open ground, whether a field, a public square, or the grounds around a monument, offered less of it. Shouted directions, word passed between neighbors, and simple visual judgment, watching which rooftops glowed and which stayed dark, likely guided people as much as any formal instruction could have. It is reasonable to imagine, with appropriate caution, small clusters of neighbors deciding together which turn to take, someone calling for children to stay close, porters shifting the weight of what they carried so they could move faster through a sudden narrow gap between two buildings. Suetonius, writing later and shaping his account around different concerns, tells us that during the days of destruction, people were driven for shelter to monuments and tombs. This is a striking detail, and it fits with what a city like Rome could plausibly have offered as refuge. Burial monuments and mausoleums were often built of stone, set apart from dense housing, and situated along the roads leading out from the city, rather than packed into commercial districts. If people did shelter among tombs, it would not have been out of any particular reverence for the dead, but simply because such structures were solid, resistant to flame, and standing on ground with fewer neighboring buildings to catch. Even so, this claim, like much of what Suetonius records, belongs to a broader literary portrait of Nero's reign, rather than a precise account with named locations or numbers of people. Tacitus adds another piece to the picture, describing how Nero eventually opened the buildings on the Campus Martius associated with Agrippa, along with his own gardens, and arranged temporary shelters for those left with nowhere else to go. This detail matters for understanding the later stages of the disaster, since it points toward an organized, if delayed, response involving public land on the western side of the city, away from the dense core where the fire had begun. But this chapter is concerned with the earlier hours of that first night, before any such organized shelter existed, when families were relying on instinct, rumor, and whatever glimpse of the skyline they could manage as they moved. Picture, then, Not a single stream of refugees heading toward one clear destination, but many smaller groups branching in different directions based on incomplete and constantly shifting information. Some may have turned toward open ground near the river, where the docks and warehouses, vulnerable as they were, at least offered wide, unbuilt stretches along the banks. Others may have pushed toward higher ground on a hill not yet touched by flame, hoping distance and elevation would bring some safety, only to find, as Tacitus suggests happened to many, that the fire had outpaced their expectations and reached places they had assumed would remain untouched. This kind of misjudgment, understandable in the confusion of the moment, likely accounts for some of the doubling back and redirected movement that must have marked the city that night. The physical experience of this movement deserves attention as well, even where the specific paths people took remain unrecoverable. Smoke would have thickened unevenly, carried by the same wind driving the fire itself, so that a street that seemed clear one moment could fill suddenly the next. Visibility would have been poor, lit mainly by a distant orange glow reflecting off smoke and rooftops, broken by patches of deeper black where alleys ran unlit. Families moving through this half-light carried what they could, children sometimes lifted onto shoulders, bundles of cloth wrapped hastily around whatever had seemed most valuable in the rushed moments after waking. The instinct to keep a family together, to call out names above the noise of the crowd, must have competed constantly with the pressure to keep moving, rather than become the one group standing still when the fire's edge finally caught up. Bottlenecks would have formed wherever the city's geography narrowed the available paths, at bridges, at gates, at the mouths of streets feeding into slightly wider public ground. Any point where several streams of fleeing residents converged into a single passage would have slowed everyone at once, turning what might have been a short walk into a long and anxious crush of bodies pressed close together. It is easy to imagine frustration and fear breaking out in such moments. Sharp words passed between strangers suddenly forced into contact, though no specific account describes such incidents in detail. What can be said with more confidence following Tacitus is that in the end, many people simply filled the roads leading out of the city or threw themselves down exhausted in the open fields beyond, having reached whatever stretch of open ground their strength and their nerve allowed them to reach. By the deeper hours of that first night, the city had effectively reorganized itself into an informal map that no one had planned and no authority had designated in advance. Certain open spaces, certain monuments, certain wide stretches of public or semi-public ground had become, through nothing more than accumulated foot traffic and shared instinct, places where frightened people gathered simply because enough others had already gathered there before them. This was not refuge in any officially sanctioned sense. It was refuge assembled on the spot, out of necessity, by ordinary people making the best decisions available to them, with very little information and even less time. It is against this backdrop of scattered, self-organized movement that the question of leadership becomes impossible to avoid. With so many households already well beyond the reach of any formal instruction, and with rumor beginning to travel almost as quickly as the fire itself, the story now turns toward what the Imperial government was doing in these same hours, and what uncertain word was beginning to spread about the Emperor's whereabouts and intentions. What uncertain word was beginning to spread about the Emperor's whereabouts and intentions? That is where the story left off, and it is worth admitting plainly that this is the point in the night where the record itself grows unreliable. Not absent, but unreliable, shaped later by writers who had their own reasons for telling the story one way rather than another. If listeners take one thing from this part of the account, it should be this: the confident image of an emperor calmly making music while his city burned is not something the earliest and most careful sources hand us as settled fact. It is a legend that grew in the telling, useful to later generations for reasons that had less to do with firefighting and more to do with reputation. What the more contemporary tradition describes instead, cautiously and with real gaps, is a scene of scattered effort and uncertain authority. Men moved through the burning districts that night, some of them identifiable as members of the Vigiles, some of them not, all of them acting as though someone somewhere had told them what to do. Buildings were pulled down in the path of the flames, a practice that made practical sense as a fire break, clearing fuel before the fire could reach it, and this is the interpretation most modern historians favor when they examine the demolition described in the record. It looks far more like an attempt at control than evidence of a real estate scheme drawn up in advance. But even here, the sources leave room for doubt, because not every voice claiming authority that night could actually prove it. This is one of the more unsettling details preserved in the ancient account historians tend to trust more closely, the one written with a more measured tone and closer to the event in time. It notes, almost in passing, that some of the men carrying out demolition and firefighting, men who insisted they were acting under orders, may not have belonged to the Vigiles at all. If that detail is accurate, it means that in the smoke and noise of that night, authority itself had become something a person could claim rather than something clearly issued from above and confirmed. A man carrying a torch and speaking with enough confidence, saying he had been sent, might have been believed simply because no one standing in a burning street had any way to check. It is worth pausing on how ordinary this kind of confusion can be, even without any deliberate deception involved. Picture for illustration only, a junior officer of the watch, a man with real training and a real chain of command above him, who suddenly finds that chain broken by distance and by smoke. He has a handful of men and a burning block in front of him, and no runner has reached him in an hour with any updated instruction. Lacking a written order, he does what seems reasonable, tearing down a row of shops to rob the flames of fuel before they reach the next street. He tells the frightened residents watching him that he is acting under orders, and in a sense he is, following the standing purpose of his unit, even if no specific command for this specific building ever traveled down through any specific voice. This is speculation about how such moments might have unfolded, offered only to show how easily genuine effort and unclear authority could look identical from the outside. Multiply that single officer by dozens of similar decisions happening at once across different districts, and the larger picture becomes easier to grasp. There was no single mind directing the response to the fire that night, not because no one cared, but because no city of that size in that period possessed the tools to coordinate a disaster of this scale in real time. Messages had to travel by runner, on foot, through streets already choked with smoke and fleeing crowds. Instructions passed from mouth to mouth, shifting slightly with each retelling, the way any spoken message does when it must cross a panicked city in the dark. By the time an order reached street level, it may have already been reshaped 2 or 3 times by people simply trying their best to remember it correctly. Rumor filled the space that clear information failed to occupy, and rumor is rarely gentle toward an absent authority figure. Word began to move through the fleeing crowds about where the emperor actually was, and the accounts that survive do not agree with one another cleanly. Some traditions place him outside the city when the fire broke out, returning only once the scale of the disaster had become undeniable. Others suggest a return timed in a way that later struck people as suspicious, whether or not that suspicion was fair. What can be said honestly is that his exact location and his exact timeline in these opening hours cannot be reconstructed with confidence from what survives, and any retelling that claims otherwise is filling gaps that the ancient record itself leaves open. That gap mattered enormously to the people living through the fire, even though it cannot be closed for us now. an emperor's presence, or even the belief in his presence, carried real weight during a crisis because it implied that someone with resources and authority understood what was happening and was preparing to respond. His absence or simple uncertainty about his whereabouts left a vacuum that rumor filled eagerly, and rumor in a burning city rarely settles for a plain explanation when a darker one is available. It was almost certainly easier that night to believe a story of deliberate neglect than to accept the less satisfying truth that even a functioning government of the period could be overwhelmed by a fire this large, moving this fast through a city built the way Rome was built. None of this should be read as excusing the confusion as harmless. Wherever real orders failed to reach the officers who needed them, buildings burned that a faster relay of information might have spared. Wherever false claims of authority went unchecked, opportunities opened for looting alongside legitimate firefighting, blurring the two so thoroughly that later observers found it almost impossible to separate one from the other. The administrative uncertainty of that night was not a minor footnote sitting beside the larger disaster. It was, in its own way, part of the disaster itself, shaping how much of the city survived those first hours and how much did not. It is also worth remembering that later writers, working once the fire had already been transformed into political memory, had reasons to sharpen the story in one direction or another. A ruler already unpopular in certain circles by the time these accounts were composed made an easy subject for exaggeration, and a single vivid image, however invented or embellished along the way, travels much further through history than a careful paragraph about broken communication lines and overworked officers trying to hold a line against smoke and heat. The fiddling emperor is exactly that kind of image. It is vivid, it is damning, and it is not something the more careful ancient record actually offers as a plain, agreed-upon fact witnessed and reported at the time. What remains, once the legend is set aside without being either fully accepted or entirely dismissed, is a night in which Rome's response to its own fire was real but disorganized, sincere in some places and self-interested in others, held together less by clear command than by scattered individuals doing what seemed necessary with whatever authority they could claim, borrow, or simply assert loudly enough to be believed. Somewhere above all of this, in a palace or perhaps still on a returning road, an emperor's exact movements remain part of the story that history cannot fully retrieve. No surviving account allows a listener to say with certainty what Nero saw, decided, or ordered in these earliest hours, only that the uncertainty surrounding him became almost immediately a story in its own right. That uncertainty did not slow the fire itself, which by this point had long since stopped waiting on anyone's decision. Flames were now visible from a distance great enough that people far from the Circus Maximus, far from the shops and warehouses where the trouble began, could see the sky changing color above their own rooftops. It is against that same smoke-hung backdrop, uncertain in its command structure and increasingly visible across the whole of the city, that the wider shape of the burning night, seen from its edges rather than its center, now comes into view. The sky changing color above their own rooftops. That is where the story left off, and it is from those distant rooftops, from courtyards and from low garden walls far removed from the Circus Maximus, that we can now try to understand what this night actually looked like to people who were not yet in immediate danger. Picture someone standing on a rooftop terrace across the river, or higher up on a hill outside the fire's original path. This is a reconstructed vantage point, not a documented one, but it offers a reasonable way to think about scale rather than spectacle. From there, the fire would not have appeared as a wall of flame or a single dramatic column reaching skyward. It more likely looked like a change in the color of the air itself, an orange stain spreading low along the horizon, where rooftops met darkness, thickening in some places and thinning in others as the wind pushed and pulled at it. Smoke does not rise evenly, and a fire spread across many streets does not produce one plume, but many, layered unevenly depending on what fuel each pocket of flame had found. Someone watching from a distance that night would likely have seen this layering directly. Pale smoke catching lamplight above the nearer glow, darker smoke settling close to the rooftops where the burning ran heaviest, and between these bands, patches of clear night sky that must have seemed almost wrong, proof that some part of the world beyond the fire remained, for the moment, ordinary. This impression of a night both broken and half intact fits what Tacitus describes when he writes of people discovering that places they had assumed were safely remote were already caught in the same disaster. It helps explain why the view from any single edge of the city could feel deceptively calm, even as the fire's reach kept widening beneath that same sky. Sound would have traveled ahead of full understanding. From a rooftop or a hillside garden, a listener might have caught fragments rather than a continuous roar, distant voices raised in warning or grief, the occasional heavy collapse of something falling far enough away to reach the ear only as a dull thud, and beneath all of it, a low sustained murmur that was really thousands of separate sounds blurring together across open space. This detail belongs to plausible reconstruction rather than to any specific ancient account, but it follows naturally from what is known about how noise carries through a city built of stone, brick, and timber, where it could ricochet down an empty street and arrive somewhere else changed almost beyond recognition. What the ancient testimony offers more directly is the human movement itself, and it is this movement that would have been visible from the margins in a way the glow alone could not fully convey. Tacitus describes crowds pressing into the streets and fleeing toward fields and open ground, discovering that even places once considered safe were no longer so. From a distance, this would have appeared as slow drifts of small figures crossing open spaces that had been empty only hours earlier, some walking in loose clusters, others alone, nearly all of them carrying something. A basket balanced against a hip, a bundle of cloth slung over one shoulder, a small chest carried awkwardly between two people who had probably never lifted it together before that night. These are the sort of ordinary, plausible details that any mass evacuation would produce, though none should be mistaken for an image drawn from a specific surviving record. At the true edges of the city, where fields, gardens, and open approaches gave way to farmland or riverbank, the crowds would have begun to slow, not because the danger had ended, but because there was simply nowhere farther to go without leaving the city's orbit altogether. Groups likely arranged themselves in loose clusters on whatever open ground was available, sitting on the bundles they had carried, speaking in low voices with neighbors they might never have exchanged a word with before that night. Someone watching from slightly higher ground, a garden wall or a low rise beyond the Campus Martius, would have seen these clusters scattered like uneven constellations across the darkened fields, each one lit faintly by whatever small lamp or torch someone had managed to bring along, all of them facing, whether by intention or not, back toward the same reddened sky. It is worth pausing on that shared orientation because it captures something true about the fire's character at this stage of the night. Nobody standing at these margins was looking at a single blaze. They were looking at a city-wide condition, a persistent glow that shifted in brightness and shape but never disappeared, because somewhere within its reach, another street, another warehouse, another block of shops was catching in turn even as they watched. This matches the pattern supported by Tacitus's account, a fire that began in one commercial district near the Circus Maximus, but that had, by this point in the night, become something distributed across many neighborhoods at once, no longer a local misfortune that people elsewhere could safely set aside. Picture someone at yet the experience of any single person at these edges remained intensely particular. A family sitting together on borrowed ground might have been entirely absorbed in counting what they had managed to bring, arguing in low voices over whether to go back for something left behind, or simply staring at the horizon without speaking, unable to take in the size of what they were witnessing. Their view of the fire was immediate and real to them, even if, a few hundred paces away, another family watching the same glow might have drawn entirely different conclusions about how close the danger actually stood. This is the tension worth holding on to through the rest of the night. The fire had become visible as one continuous citywide event, yet it was still being lived out one street, one rooftop, one family at a time. There would also have been those at the edges who were not fleeing at all, but simply standing and watching because they could do nothing else. Shopkeepers whose own districts had not yet caught might have stood in their doorways, unsure whether to bar their shutters or begin loading a cart. Off-duty laborers, roused by neighbors shouting, may have climbed to whatever high point their building allowed, less to plan an escape than to judge by the shifting color of the sky whether the fire was moving toward them or away. None of these particular figures can be named or confirmed, but the posture itself, watching from just outside the danger, trying to read distance and wind in the color of smoke, is a reasonable and human response to the scene the ancient sources describe. For those farther out still, near the aqueducts or along the roads leading from the city, the fire might have looked almost peaceful from a great enough remove, a warm smear of light low against the horizon, more like a sunset lingering too long than a disaster. It would have taken the accumulating stream of refugees, arriving in growing numbers with soot on their clothes and little else in their hands, to correct that impression and make clear that this was not a distant glow to be admired, but a wound spreading through the heart of the city they had left behind. As the night wore on, this scattered watching began to give way to something heavier, a fatigue built not from any single terrifying moment, but from hour after hour of sustained uncertainty, of counting belongings, of searching the same reddened sky for some sign that it was finally beginning to fade. It is in that slow accumulation of exhaustion, rather than in any fresh burst of spectacle, that the fire's human cost would become most fully apparent as the first light of dawn started to rise over a city that, by every account, had not yet stopped burning. A city that, by every account, had not yet stopped burning. That is where the story left off, and it is exactly this fact, plain and unglamorous, that defines what dawn actually brought to Rome. Dawn did not deliver resolution. It did not offer a single moment anyone could point to and say, "Here, this is where the fire finally lost its grip." What arrived instead was simply enough light to see by, and what that light revealed was a city still very much inside its own disaster, not emerging from it. Consider first what a night like this does to a body before it does anything to a city. In the hours before sunrise, most people caught up in the fire had been awake far longer than they ever intended to be. Shopkeepers who had closed their stalls at an ordinary evening hour were still standing in the street 12 hours later, ash gathering in their hair, throats raw from smoke and from shouting over the noise of collapse and flight. Prolonged sleep loss narrows attention and slows even the simplest decisions, where to go, what to carry, whom to look for, into something closer to struggle. Multiply that ordinary human strain across an entire city, and dawn becomes less a mercy than the first real chance for exhausted people to measure how much they had already lost. Tacitus, writing decades later but drawing on testimony and memory reaching back to this very night, describes the fire's human toll in terms that still carry weight. He writes of terror moving through crowds, of the frailty of age slowing escape, of children unable to save themselves and depending entirely on whoever happened to be nearby. He does not treat this as background detail. He treats it as the central fact of the disaster, more central even than the flames themselves. That framing matters here, at the edge of morning, because it tells us plainly what the ancient record understood dawn to reveal: not a fire winding down, but a population still trying, minute by minute, to hold itself together. By the time the sky began to lighten, the fire had already burned long enough that many people had lost any reliable sense of how much time had passed. This is a detail worth imagining carefully without overstating it as documented fact. After enough hours spent moving, carrying, and searching, a person's internal clock becomes unreliable. Some who fled in the earliest hours may have believed dawn came sooner than it did. Others, numbed by fatigue, might have felt the night stretch on longer than any clock would have shown, had anyone been keeping one. This blurring of time is not simply atmosphere added for effect. It is a well-documented feature of prolonged crisis, and it helps explain why so many accounts of disasters like this one describe the shift into morning as confusing rather than clarifying. What dawn did make clear, with the kind of blunt honesty only daylight provides, was the physical toll already inflicted on the city. Streets passable hours earlier were now blocked by fallen material, abandoned carts, and belongings dropped mid-flight once carrying them became too difficult. Buildings that had still stood, damaged but upright, in the middle of the night were revealed by morning light as hollow shells or heaps of blackened timber. This is close to what Tacitus gestures toward when he describes people crowding into open streets and fields, having lost not only their homes but, in his words, their daily bread, the basic means of feeding themselves from one day to the next. That single detail matters more than it first appears. It tells us the fire had already moved past simple property loss and into something closer to a subsistence crisis for a great many ordinary residents. For the Vigiles and whatever other men had spent the night trying to slow the fire's advance, dawn brought its own particular exhaustion, distinct from that of the fleeing households. These were not soldiers trained for sustained combat, nor firefighters equipped with anything resembling later tools. They worked with buckets, with hooks meant to pull down burning structures before flames could leap to the next roofline, applying the same exhausting physical effort again and again through the darkest hours. Tacitus adds a detail worth taking seriously without turning it into sensation. He reports that some efforts to contain the fire were obstructed, that people were seen throwing firebrands or discouraging containment work, occasionally claiming they acted under orders. Whether this reflects organized interference, isolated opportunism, or confusion mistaken for intent, the surviving record does not let us say with confidence. What can be said is that this obstruction, whether real or only rumored, added distrust to a body of men already worn down by an impossible night, and by dawn many of them had little strength left to give, while the fire in several districts showed no corresponding sign of slowing. It is worth pausing on the emotional register of this hour, because distance can easily flatten disaster into a single dramatic note. The picture suggested by the sources is quieter than that, though no less painful. People searched for family members lost somewhere in the crowd during the night's confusion. Parents tried to keep children calm while unsure themselves of where safety actually lay. Elderly residents, moved as best as neighbors and relatives could manage, now sat on unfamiliar open ground, uncertain whether their homes still existed at all. This was not a scene of continuous screaming panic. It resembled something closer to numbness, the particular stillness that follows once the first surge of adrenaline has worn away, and only fatigue and uncertainty remain in its place. The Night Stair troops had seen it 40 years later. Something resists any tidy narrative closure, and it is also the detail modern reconstructions insist on preserving carefully. The blaze that had begun somewhere near the Circus Maximus, whatever its exact origin, had by this point spread across a wide and uneven front, advancing through some districts while merely smouldering in others, occasionally flaring again in places thought already exhausted. Dawn did not arrive to find the fire finished. It arrived to find the fire still selecting its next direction, still discovering fuel in structures that had only survived the night because the flames had not yet reached them. For people watching from open ground, this must have carried its own weight of exhaustion, the growing sense that even now, after everything already endured, there was no single clear moment allowing them to say the danger had passed. This is why the ancient testimony and the modern historians who study it resist describing that first night as a contained or finished episode by morning. It was not one blaze extinguished neatly by daybreak. It was a city-wide condition that daylight simply made easier to see in its full extent. The exhaustion was real, spread across shopkeepers, watchmen, officials, and the displaced alike. The losses, still being counted in scattered fields and along crowded roadsides, were real as well, and the fire itself, indifferent to how long it had already burned or how tired the city beneath it had become, continued moving through Rome's vulnerable streets exactly as it had through the night, following fuel and wind rather than any human sense of how long a disaster ought reasonably to last. What remained, then, as full daylight spread over the ruined districts and the displaced crowds still gathered wherever open ground could be found, was not an ending, but the beginning of a different kind of reckoning. Rome would now have to measure, slowly and imperfectly, how much had actually been lost overnight, how much still stood in danger, and how much of what people believed about these hours would later be reshaped by memory, by rumor, and by the uncertain distance separating what was witnessed from what would eventually be told, a distance the story must now follow into its final and most disputed chapter. A distance separating what was witnessed from what would eventually be told. That is where the story left off, and it is the right place to end, because that distance is now the subject itself. We have spent this night moving through smoke and crowded lanes with people who left no names behind, and it is worth pausing, in the calm after that motion, to ask plainly what we can actually say we know and what we are still only inferring with care. We can say with real confidence that the fire began near the Circus Maximus, in the crowded stretch of shops and stalls where the great arena's structures met the slopes of the Palatine and Caelian hills. The historian Tacitus, writing decades after the event but drawing on testimony and record closer to it, places the ignition there, among goods described as inflammable, the kind of stock a commercial district naturally accumulates. Oils, cloth, timber, baskets, the ordinary flammable clutter of urban trade. This is not legend. It is about as solid an anchor as ancient history offers, a specific location tied to a specific kind of fuel, recorded by a writer working within living memory of people who had actually been there that night. We can also say, with similar confidence, that the fire spread with unusual speed, and that this speed had identifiable causes rather than mysterious ones. Tacitus attributes it to wind, which caught the flames and drove them along a fairly predictable path, and to the physical character of old Rome itself, a city of narrow, winding streets and irregular passageways that had grown organically over centuries, rather than being planned with any thought toward containment. A fire that might have stayed local in a more open, more regularly laid out city, found in Rome exactly the conditions it needed to become something far larger. This was not a moral failing belonging to any single person that night. It was a structural feature of how the city had been built, block by block, generation by generation, with little coordination and even less foresight for disaster. From there, the confident claims begin to thin, though they do not disappear entirely. We know that households fled with whatever they could carry, and that this process was uneven, sometimes successful, often desperately incomplete. We know that market districts and warehouses caught quickly, turning stored goods into fuel and transforming a residential misfortune into something closer to a citywide commercial catastrophe. We know that people converged on open ground, on the Campus Martius, on monuments and public spaces, though the exact paths any single family took that night are beyond recovery and should be understood as reconstruction shaped by pattern rather than by direct record. We know the Vigiles were active in the chaos, the Imperial watchmen whose ordinary duty was fire suppression and night patrol, and modern historians treat their presence as well established, even as the details of their conduct remain harder to pin down. Some accounts describe them fighting the flames directly. Others describe them tearing down buildings ahead of the fire's path, a defensive tactic meant to create breaks the flames could not easily cross. Still others, less flatteringly, describe looting amid the confusion. All of these threads appear in the surviving tradition, and a careful listener should hold them as plausible rather than certain, since the sources blend genuine memory with later moralizing in ways that are difficult to fully untangle now. And then there is Nero, whose name has become almost synonymous with this fire in popular memory, more so perhaps than any other figure from Roman antiquity. It is worth being direct about what the evidence actually supports here, because this is where legend has done the most damage to plain understanding. The ancient sources do not present Nero as the calm, deliberate arsonist of later imagination, nor do they present him as a single, clear organizer of an effective firefighting response. What they show instead is confusion, uncertain word about the emperor's location, rumor moving through the crowds nearly as fast as the flames themselves, actions attributed to imperial authority that may or may not have actually originated from any coherent chain of command. The famous image of Nero playing music while the city burned belongs to a later literary and political tradition, shaped by writers who had every reason, personal, political, or simply narrative, to sharpen the emperor into a villain equal to the scale of the disaster. That image may contain some seed of a rumor that circulated even in the ancient world, but it is not something the first night's evidence can establish as settled fact, and treating it as such collapses a complicated, poorly documented night into a tidy story the sources themselves do not fully support. A distance separating, this is, in a sense, the central lesson the first night offers about how history is made and how it is later reshaped by those who inherit it. A dense, fire-prone city experienced a fast-moving disaster that overwhelmed whatever ordinary emergency response existed. That much is about as certain as ancient evidence allows anyone to be. But the moment we ask more pointed questions, who exactly ordered what, who stood where, who felt which emotion at which specific hour, the evidence grows thinner, and what fills the gap is often not memory but narrative, constructed later by people with their own purposes, sharpened over retellings until a plausible rumor calcifies into an unshakable image. The fire itself is a dated, factual event, conventionally placed in the year 64. What happened afterward to its memory is a different kind of story, one that belongs less to that single night than to the decades and centuries that followed it. If we return, finally, to the city itself, away from the disputed question of blame, what remains is something plainer and in some ways more instructive: an ordinary summer evening, shops closing, lamps being lit, a night watch beginning its rounds much as it had many nights before, and then, within a matter of hours, an entire dense urban fabric proving just how vulnerable it truly was. Timber construction, packed lodging blocks, narrow lanes never meant to serve as escape routes, warehouses stacked with combustible goods, all of it resting beneath the surface of daily life until a single point of ignition and a favorable wind revealed exactly how fragile that daily life had been all along. This is the honest core of the story, more durable than any anecdote about the emperor, and far more useful for understanding how ancient cities actually worked and how easily their ordinary arrangements could fail them. The fire did not end with this first night. and its long afterlife in politics, in later writing, in the layered mythology that eventually attached itself to Nero's name, extends far beyond what any single evening can explain. But the night itself, examined on its own terms, gives us something valuable and comparatively rare, a clear, well-anchored picture of an ordinary city meeting extraordinary circumstance, its people reacting with instincts anyone might recognize, gathering belongings, calling out to neighbors, moving toward whatever ground still felt safe, while officials somewhere in the growing smoke struggled to impose order on something that had already outpaced them. That is the Rome worth remembering from this night, not the legend that grew up around it afterward, but the very real, very human city that burned, and the ordinary evening that, without warning, became history. And it is with that understanding settled gently in place that this long night, its fires still glowing somewhere beyond the rooftops, can at last be allowed to rest, its questions carried forward, its people, for now, safe enough to close their eyes.